Okay, good morning. Um, our topic today is planning for caregiver succession. In other words, what happens if you can no longer take primary responsibility for the care of your loved one with dementia? As Pat was doing the devotions, I was thinking about a quote that she shared with me a while back that I think is particularly pertinent right now. And in fact, to the dementia journey in general. And that's that there is a difference between planning for the future and living in the future. Planning for the future simply gives us the tools we need to deal with eventualities that might occur. Living in the future fills us with anxiety and worry and lots of what ifs and can I's, and is a much less productive process. So, what we want to talk about today is planning, um, thinking through what might happen and how we might prepare for it now. Let's talk first, about exactly what succession planning is. It's a concept primarily from business that talks about a process for training and developing, and those two words are key, employees, especially those in top management, to ensure that when there are changes in a company caused by retirement or employees leaving or an expansion in the company, there's someone prepared to take over those top leadership roles. It's really preparing for the possibility of what might happen in the future while ensuring that business is not interrupted by these inevitable changes. So, why do we even need to think about this with caregivers? Let me give you a few pieces of information and some statistics to tell you why we need to think about it. There's a frequently cited 1999 study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the study dealt with spousal caregivers over the age of 65 and looked at the effects of mental and emotional strain on the health of those individuals. And I think we would all agree that we have some degree of mental and emotional strain in the caregiving process. What this study found is that caregivers who are experiencing mental or emotional strain have a 63% higher mortality rate than non-caregivers during the 4 years that were included in this study. Another study showed that about 40% of Alzheimer's spousal caregivers died from stress-related disorders prior to the person for whom they were caring. There's a 2018 study that looks at the same kind of mortality information and lowered that number to 20%. But when you think about 1 in 5 primary caregivers dying before the person for whom they're caring, that's still a significant number. Then there are these pieces of information that come from the 2022 Alzheimer's disease facts and figures. Caring for a spouse with dementia is associated with a 30% increase in depressive symptoms compared to caring for a spouse without dementia. The prevalence of anxiety among dementia caregivers is about 44%, which is higher than the next most frequent group of caregivers, which are caregivers of people with stroke, where anxiety is only prevalent in 31% of that population. And about 30% of the people caring for persons living with dementia are 65 or older. So they're more likely, by virtue of their age, to have more health conditions that predispose to some degree of impact on their ability to continue to provide care. So, what is caregiver succession planning? It's designated someone who can take over the care of your loved one with dementia. If you're unable to continue being the primary caregiver, whether that's on a temporary or permanent basis, and then ensuring that that person has access to all the pertinent information to successfully care for your loved one. So where do we start? There are really 4 steps in this process, 4 broad categories that we need to address in thinking about having someone prepared to take over our caregiving responsibilities. Designating a backup caregiver, making a list of caregiver needs, assembling pertinent medical information, and then conveying appropriate financial information. So let's take a minute to think a little bit more in depth about each of those categories. The first thing we think about when we think about designating a backup caregiver is the person you would choose to do that already designated as your loved one's backup power of attorney for health care? It's likely that you are the primary power of attorney for that person for health care. Hopefully, in the process of doing those powers of attorney, you have also named people who are able to take that responsibility if you're no longer able to exercise that. Are those the people who are appropriate to take care of your loved one if something happens to you, to make the decisions about their care, to know that they have what they need on a day-to-day basis? It makes sense that that would be the person and that we would have considered those things when we designated backup caregivers. But I know that, for instance, when my husband and I first did powers of attorney, I didn't think so much about who might take over the actual long-term caregiving. I thought about who can make decisions if there's a medical emergency and I can't do it, or if I'm temporarily, if I have a heart attack or a stroke and I'm temporarily not able to do that, but not so much what the long-term implications of someone having that responsibility perhaps for several years. So you may need to go back and look at who those backup people are as you think about succession planning, and ask yourselves whether those are the people who could handle these responsibilities on a long-term basis. If it's not, and your loved one is still at the point cognitively that they can change powers of attorney, you may want to consider that. For most of us, it's going to be too late to take that step, and we will have to then decide if that person's not the most appropriate person, who is the most appropriate person to work with that individual to provide this care. In thinking about a backup caregiver, not only do we have to think about who can do it and is willing to do it, but we also have to think about who has at least a basic understanding of dementia or is willing to learn more about dementia to fulfill this role. How can they do that? Can you share with them what you're learning in classes? Point them to videos that you found particularly helpful. Have some kind of regular discussion with them about how your loved one is doing and what the current issues are and how you're dealing with those. Can you trust this person to follow through with what the two of you have agreed is the best plan for your loved one with dementia, knowing that things may change and there may need to be some alterations in the plan, but that as long as they stick with the spirit of what you're talking about as priorities, that they can make those decisions appropriately. Can they be a good advocate for the person living with dementia? One of the things that we all have learned by now is that the role of advocate for our loved one is one of the primary roles that we encounter as a dementia caregiver. We have to be able to stand our ground to make sure that they get appropriate medical care, appropriate therapies, appropriate interactions with other people. And in cases where we are talking about end-of-life care, maybe stand our ground when others in the family disagree with the decision that we're making. Where does this person live that you're considering? While ultimately it makes it a whole lot easier if the person lives close by, many of us have families and other people who would be the best ones to step in who don't necessarily live in close proximity to where we are. What difference will it make if the person living with dementia has to move, if something happens to you? What if they're already in a facility? Do they change facilities? What happens in that circumstance? What are the goals of care for your loved one? What is it that you and he or she have agreed to, either implicitly or explicitly, that are the goals that you work toward, or that you know inherently from having lived with this person or been associated with them for a long period of time? And then, is this person that is going to be your backup caregiver designated, covered by a HIPAA authorization so that they can have access to the medical records of the person living with dementia? And you can have, as if you are already power of attorney, can sign a HIPAA authorization for someone else to have access to those records. And that will allow them to have conversations with medical staff, even if something happens with you. Okay. As we think about relaying information and what the needs are of the person living with dementia, there are kind of three categories that we can break that down into to make relaying that information a little easier and a little more organized in our mind. The first category is safety. What you say about this category will depend on where the person is with dementia, where their functioning level is currently. And it will vary from time to time. It may be, as we talk later about how to record this information, that you start writing safety information and put a date beside of it. And as of this day, this is what this person can do. And then update that with subsequent dates as their abilities change. You may be talking about whether this person living with dementia could contact another person if there was an emergency, whether they understood that process. You have to consider also, is wandering or leaving home a problem? What about being awake during the night and the safety issues that might bring? And do they have balance problems or frequent falls? The second category is normal everyday tasks. Typically, when we talk about normal everyday tasks, we divide those into two different categories that I'm listing here because you may well see these referred to in information that you have. And they are one of those things, if you have long-term care insurance, that asks specifically about ADLs and IADLs. So let's talk about those just a minute. Those both deal with everyday tasks that have to be done to care for someone. Activities of daily living, or ADLs, include self-care things like bathing, dressing, grooming, toileting, and transferring or moving from one surface to another. Instrumental activities of daily living, or IADLs, include the ability to manage finances, drive or navigate public transportation, use the telephone, manage their own medications, do housework, and basic home management. In other words, all of those activities that support our being able to live in a home on an ongoing basis. The other thing we have to think about and provide some information about is emotional support. Included in this would be such things as what activities does this person enjoy doing? What are they able to engage in? What is their usual activity level? Also, a big part of this would be behaviors. Is this person having any problems with behaviors that are disruptive and difficult to deal with? If so, what are they? How do you respond to them to calm things down? And what might trigger those behaviors? Perhaps the biggest category of information that we would need to relay is pertinent medical information. And looking at this category feels overwhelming, but I'm going to give you some tips and give you some resources for how to organize this information that might make it a little bit easier for you to do. This is also one of the most important categories, even though it's one of the most time-consuming to put together. Include in it information about current medical providers, including dentist, ophthalmologist, audiologist, if they have hearing aids and are still using those, any therapist they might be seeing, the contact information for that individual, name, address, office phone number, the last date they saw them, when is the next appointment, and perhaps in some ways, most importantly, how do we access the electronic medical record through the patient portal for that provider? What are the current diagnoses for the person living with dementia and past diagnoses that are important? Some of those past diagnoses really don't make a difference, but things such as stroke, heart attack, past COVID infection may have a significant impact on what happens and some of the manifestations that occur during dementia. What are the current medications that this person is taking? And include in that medications to avoid and the reasons for that. Some of the reasons may be allergy. Some of them may be this person has Lewy body dementia and this medication is an absolute no-no for someone with this diagnosis, and what pharmacy that you use. Here's a simple way to organize that information. And what I did was just set up tables in word processing program, in Word in this case, so that there's name, address, and the role of these medical care providers, and then the medication. I think it would be easier, as I was doing this, I was thinking about what do you do if the dosage on a medication is changed and you're recording that. And as I showed you in this first example, I think it's easier to say that the medication was stopped at that dosage than to try to write over it or change it in any other way. Even if you're doing this electronically, you still have this history of, so you could say if the dosage was increased, you could just say that it was stopped on that date and then make a second entry that said what the new dosage was and what the start date of that was. But these are simple ways that you can organize some of this information and keep it either to print out or to keep it electronically. Other information that is important to have from a medical perspective is any immunizations and when they were given. And we don't need to go all the way back to polio, although given the resurgence of that in a few areas, that might be asked at some point in time. But what in particular, what we need to know is what COVID vaccines have they had and what boosters, whether they've had the pneumonia vaccine and whether they've had the shingles vaccine. Any special dietary restrictions or a diet? Are they on a diabetic diet? Can they only have soft foods? is there something that they are allergic to in the food category that we need to flag? And also any concerns with feeding and swallowing. Many people, as the dementia as the dementia progresses, have problems with swallowing at times, and that may be something you need to flag for somebody else to pay attention to. Does the person with dementia have recurrent problems such as urinary tract infections or pneumonia? Do they use any medical devices like CPAPs or BiPAPs? And what's the end of life care wishes for this person? What's important to them as they approach the end of life? What things are important to do and what things are important not to do in those circumstances? And the last category is financial information. It's hard to be a primary care provider for an individual if you don't have any idea about financial resources. And this is not to say that if this person is not your backup financial power of attorney or the backup financial power of attorney for the person living with dementia, that they have to know everything about the finances, but they need to know who that backup financial power of attorney is and how to contact them. A little bit about the financial resources and how to access them. And it may be, again, that all of that goes through the person who would then be acting as the financial power of attorney. They also need to have some idea about whether you have long-term care insurance or not, as the availability of that may impact the services that they can put in place to support the person living with dementia. So here's all this information that feels overwhelming to relay. How are we going to communicate it with the person who agrees to be the next caregiver if something happens with us? First of all, we need to provide a copy of any legal documents to that person, including powers of attorney. Certainly, if they are the backup power of attorney for the person living with dementia, I hope they already have that. But they need to have that information so they know who that person is. It also would be helpful if they had a copy of a living will, because that does spell out more information, particularly about end-of-life care and what's desired and not desired. If there is a do not resuscitate order for the person with dementia, it helps to give them a copy of that. And for do not resuscitate orders, copies are acceptable as originals if they need to use that. And again, a copy of that HIPAA authorization so that they have proof that it has been signed and that they can have access to medical records. You can either put this information together in a binder, or you may prefer to keep it electronically. One of the advantages of keeping it electronically would be that there are a number of programs out there that you can securely set up file sharing so that the person who has agreed to become your backup primary caregiver can have access to that information in an ongoing way as you update it. That will keep them up to date and give them access to more information more immediately in some instances, especially if they don't live really close by, than having information in a binder. Regardless of which way you keep information, it's important to talk to that person in person or to provide email updates on the status of your loved one with dementia on a regular basis. That's a lot of information crammed into a very short period of time as we've talked today. And I'm sure as you try to work through this, you'll have questions that come up. Please feel free to email me those or ask me. But I also have listed on this slide that you can either take a picture of now, or because this will be posted on Pat's YouTube page, can go back to later and look at. These are the resources that I found most helpful in thinking through some of the questions that you need to answer when you talk about a person to succeed you in being the primary caregiver for your loved one. The first one gives some really good information on how to organize medical information. The second, the AARP Family Caregiving Guide, has information that helps you think through some of your goals of care and what the needs of the person are. Care plans are something that we typically think about, at least in healthcare. As a nurse, it was one of those necessary but not welcomed activities that we had to engage in so that everyone was kind of on the same page in caring for a patient. That would also be true if you're talking about someone succeeding you as a caregiver, to put you on the same page as them. This has a link to a care plan format and some links to additional resources that you might find helpful. And the last resource is 5 Wishes. Some of you may have heard of this. This is a booklet, actually, that guides you through thinking about and recording desires for end-of-life care. And that will prompt you to think about some things you may not have considered before. And again, as you make those decisions about the person who's living with dementia, it will help you think through those, even if you end up being the primary caregiver for the entirety of their lives. I hope this helps. It's a starting place. It is not the end. You have to keep on top of things. And I know that sounds like a huge undertaking when you already have so much to do in caring for your loved one. But most of us find that we need to go back and look at this information from time to time anyway to answer questions as our loved one's status changes. So even if you never have to have someone to succeed you as the primary caregiver, having this information thought through and organized will help you at various points in your caregiving journey also. Thank you.